Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Esther Archange, and I am an academic trainer with the Center for Teaching and Learning. Today's session is titled The Legacy of Black Literacy, Disrupting the Myth with Harvey Bakari, the president of Bakari Historical Services, LLC. In celebration of Black History Month, we have asked Harvey Bakari to present in this webinar series. We are thrilled to have him return to NCU today. Thank you for being here. Just a couple of housekeeping items before the presentation. I am recording the webinar and the video will be posted on the Center for Teaching and Learning LibGuides webinar page within 24 hours. If you have questions throughout today's session, you can type them in the Q&A feature located at the bottom of the Zoom window. Be sure to use the feature to ask questions to our presenters. In addition, the chat feature is open for dialogue and conversation. We welcome all questions, so please don't be shy. With that, I will turn it over to one of NCU webinar regulars, Harvey Bakari.
Well, thank you, Esther. Welcome North Central University faculty, staff, and students to the 2022 Black History Month webinar, The Legacy of Black Literacy and Disrupting the Myth. Now, I'm your presenter, Harvey Bakari of Bakari Historical Services. I present presentations to broaden the significance of early African-American history, to promote education, awareness, celebration, and inclusion for organizations in the communities they serve. My vision is that history can change the present. So I have 23 years of professional museum experience at Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Now, today, my approach to history is I focus on a shared and divided history of African, European, and Native American descent people in early America. You might be thinking, what do you mean shared and divided? For instance, during the American Revolution, Black and white soldiers, and for matter of fact, and Native American soldiers fought to defeat the British. They had a shared interest in defeating the British. But once the war was over, the issues of race and citizenship were divided. So that's what I mean by shared and divided. It goes back and forth. But that's the approach that I will take to presenting the history today. Also, just to talk about a couple of the terminologies. Today, when we think of literacy, we think of literacy in terms of the ability to read and write. But historically, in the 16 and 1700s, it was thought of as the ability to read or write. Sometimes you could read, but you didn't know how to write. So writing was considered the higher skill. So I'm going to be speaking in terms of literacy within those terms today. Now, we're going to have a poll question today because it's something that comes up quite frequently, something that's repeated in movies, documentaries. I've seen scholars repeat it over and over again, that slaves were forbidden to read and write. And so I want to know how many of you heard that and how many of you believe that is the second part of it. But really the question is a yes or no question. Do you believe that it was illegal for slaves to learn to read and write? I've seen many times people would say slaves would be killed if they were caught reading and writing. But we're going to examine that today using some primary documents. Next, I'm going to be focusing on free Blacks and enslaved people from the 1600s to about the 1830s, before the time period of Frederick Douglass. So when we talk about literacy, we're talking about assumptions that people make or a myth. Now, a couple of other things, terminology, just to let you know today, I'll be using certain terms that are not proper today, but I'm teaching history. So in that fact, I have to use it in a historical context. So for example, I will make a distinction between whites and Europeans. Whites, I'm using that for people in the Americas, people of European descent in the Americas. I want you to think about it for a moment. Historian Peter Wood said the term white would not have been a useful term in Europe before the slave trade. Because who are you saying is white in Europe? Okay, so it was not going to be, people were going to identify other people by their ethnicity. They're British, they're Irish, Wales, Scotland, and so forth, French. They're not, that's not a useful term. But in the Americas, the term white becomes an umbrella term for all people of European descent to fit under that umbrella, no matter where they fit in the hierarchy of superior whites and poor and maybe inferior whites. They're going to fit under that umbrella. So that's how I'm using the terms. I'm not using whites for people in Europe. I'm using Europeans, only using whites for those who are native born Creole, sometimes a term that's used in the Americas. Also, I'll be using terms for the non-Christians, non-whites. For Native Americans, I may have to use the term Indian. For African Americans, I may have to use the term Negro, mulatto. Now, mulatto is a derogatory term. Today, we would say a biracial person, in this case, particularly of African and European descent. I may use the term enslaved as well as slave, free Blacks as well as free Negroes. Now, another thing about working in the museum, and it's a difficult part of teaching history, is trying to avoid presentism. Presentism means looking at history from our 21st century views, because that's going to skew history up. Because for example, it's no way that we know how people are going to identify us 50 or 100 years from now. They're going to look at this pandemic and say, oh yeah, the pandemic started in 2020 and it ended in 2028 or whenever it ends, because we don't know when it's going to end. So try to focus on the history and its time period, not by our 21st century sensibilities. Sometimes it can be a little tricky, but if you really want to understand it, you have to understand the historical context. So I try to build up the context. I'll be talking about religion, and this doesn't have to do with anyone's personal faith. It's the role of history. I mean, the role of religion in the history of slavery and slave trade. Obviously, I'll be talking about race and slavery, and I've had over 23 years talking to people face to face as a museum professional, also doing all other types of performances. Now, speaking of performances, just to let you know my style, I'm very passionate about what I do, and sometimes I'm animated. So if I'm animated, it doesn't mean that I'm upset or anything like that. That's just part of my style of interpreting history. So let's begin by looking at something many of you may be familiar with. The Brown versus the Board of Education decision in 1954. Thurgood Marshall represented 5 different plaintiffs from around the country. One of them was from Virginia, in Farmville, Virginia. And they were trying to demolish, that was the Plessy versus Ferguson, which ruled that separate but equal was constitutional in the United States. And one way they wanted to do it is to demonstrate, in this case, when they were addressing public education, is the impact that segregation was having on African-American children. And this is a test that was created by Dr. Keith Clark and his wife, Dr. Mamie Clark. And some of you may be familiar with this, some of you may not. It may seem very, very simplistic. They were psychologists, but Thurgood Marshall, he thought it was important to add just a little extra to the case that they were presenting before the Supreme Court. And they wanted to not just use legal terminology, but they wanted to present to the justices the impact that this was having on children between the ages of 3 and 7 years of age. So if you have a child between the age of 3 and 7 or a grandchild, you can know what they typically are like at that time, how impressionable they are. So imagine children, these were African-American children who attended segregated schools, who participated in this test, and there were 8 simple questions. But those simple questions raised some very important points about what they were receiving as children in society that maybe others couldn't or didn't notice. So the first question, give me the doll that you like to play with. Give me the doll that is the nice doll. Give me the doll that looks bad. Give me the doll that has nice color. Give me the doll that looks like a white child. Give me the doll that looks like a colored child. Give me the doll that looks like a Negro child. Give me the doll that looks like you. Now, these dolls are in the African American Museum of History and Culture in Washington, D.C. They were donated by the Clark's daughter. So that's where they can be found. Now, one thing that Dr. Clark said is when he conducted this test with children who attended segregated schools, he says, it now shows me that the doll that most of you, he said, I'm sorry, excuse me. He said, now, when he said, now show me the doll that's most like you, some of the children became emotionally upset at having to identify with the doll that they rejected. Some of them even stormed out the room. Because again, if you're familiar, if you've raised 3 to 7 year olds or adopted or just around 3 to 7 year olds, you can imagine the idea that they identify with something that they find objectionable. As a matter of fact, he said most of the Black kids identified and saw themselves as the white doll, but they knew when they looked in the mirror, they looked like the Black doll. But that was not the only psychological presentation. Some sociology was introduced into the Supreme Court case by someone not known as well as the doll test, but Louisa Holt. And she was an expert witness on to testify. And she said that a sense of inferiority must always affect one's motivation for learning, since it affects the feeling one has of one's self as a person. Further, she said the legal and official sanction of segregation reinforces that sense of inferiority in the minds of both white and Blacks. So the test did not, at that point, did not use any white children, but she made the point that this affected white children as well. So that's just kind of the setup for this presentation, because it makes assumptions about intelligence. As the children are rejecting those Black dolls growing up in the 1950s, the 40s and 50s, they are absorbing from society their self-image. And sometimes, as the psychologist says, it leads to self-hate. So one aspect, which I'm going to focus on, is the part of intelligence. Did the children think of the white doll as a more intelligent child? Did they see themselves as less intelligent? And when we continue to say, now this is just my question, when we continue to say that slaves or their ancestors were forbidden to read and write, does that continue to create a sense of less than when it comes to intelligence? So we'll see I'll see what your responses are near the end of the presentation. All right, now I've broken the presentation down into these 5 segments. After each segment, I'm going to ask Esther if there are any questions that you may have, and I'll try to answer those questions. If the question requires a little bit more time, then I will go more towards the end of the presentation to ask questions that require more time. So I'm going to start off with these 5 sections: European and African slavers, African victims, Black literacy, sacred and secular, identity, protest, and publication, and when did Black literacy become illegal? So I'm going to begin with the first segment, and then we'll see if you have any questions after this first segment. European and African slavers. One of the questions that I would normally get when I was working in the museum, people would say, why do you keep talking about slavery? Slavery is nothing new. Slavery has always been around in history. Greeks, Romans, other ethnic groups have had slavery. And I was like, true, that's true. I say, but there is something unique about slavery here in the United States. And I would even go a step further. Africans weren't the first to be enslaved or first victims of the slave trade. The first victims of the slave trade in the Americas were Native Americans. Yes, there was a trade of Native Americans who would be taken from the Caribbean to the Carolinas to New England before the Europeans turned towards using Africans. Another source of labor, unfree labor in the colonies, were white indentured servants, many of them coming voluntarily, some involuntarily, who were convicts. They might work 5 to 7 years, but they would become free after their time period. But again, their owners were trying to treat them very close as possible to being a slave in name only, not just a name only. And then, of course, 1619, we talk about 1619, the first Africans who arrived in Virginia. That's British North America. By 1510, almost 500,000 Africans had already been enslaved in South America, the Caribbean, before the 20-odd Negroes were entered into or transported to Virginia in 1619. As a matter of fact, I would say to the person, only about roughly 4% of the 12 million Africans or so who survived the voyage across the Atlantic, only about 4 to 6% came here to British North America. So then people would be surprised by that. Really, I didn't know. I say, yeah, that's true. But let me tell you why it's significant and why it continues to come up in conversations when it pertains to African-American history, which is American history. It comes up because the Atlantic slave trade and slavery is inseparable from the foundation of this nation. The Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution. It's a part of America's DNA. It's a part of that shared and divided history. It might be something that people don't like, but it's just like a strain of DNA. If you do a DNA test, you can't go in and say, well, can you take that part out of my this ancestor, and can I take that ancestor out? You can't. It's inseparable. So the fact that it's connected to the founding of our nation, it's connected to our founding documents, is one of the reasons why it continues to be a subject for all Americans in this country. So let me give you an example. Now, as we go through the European you're going to see European slave trade, Brandy, King George. I'll talk about them in just a moment. But let's look at the connection, for example, between the Declaration of Independence and the Atlantic slave trade. Of course, you know that Thomas Jefferson, he drafted the Declaration of Independence, and in his first draft, he had 19 arguments of why we should separate from Great Britain. But his most personal attack on King George, which could have got him killed, drawn and quartered, treason, but his most personal attack on King George had to do with the slave trade. It was the longest of the 19 grievances. Some of you may be familiar with this. You can look it up at any time. It said he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty. He says he's attacking a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery. It is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Now, that's Thomas Jefferson's uppercase Christian. He's pointing out the hypocrisy. The king who is determined to keep open a market where men would be bought and sold. This assemblage of horrors. This is one of our founding fathers, President of the United States, saying this in 1776. Now, his colleagues did not include this section because the King of England was not the only European king or queen monarchy that was profiting from the transatlantic slave trade. So this is inseparable from our founding documents and our founding fathers. So this is American history. But let's take it a step further. Many of you may know about Crispus Attucks in 1770 in Boston, the Boston Massacre. But Crispus Attucks was shot and killed, but there was a very active Black population in Boston. And I've used this over and over again because I think it's important for people to realize that literacy was important because they wrote about their experiences. They wrote about their experiences, and this is written 2 years before Jefferson. And this is firsthand account from apparently Africans who are saying we were a freeborn people who would never forfeit this blessing by any compact whatsoever. And they're unjustly dragged by the cruel hand of power. That would be King George. as Jefferson would say with the Declaration of Independence, that they're stolen from the bosom of their parents and taken from a populous, pleasant, and plentiful country. I'm going to tag on to that for a moment, and then made slaves for life in a Christian land. So you could almost put Jefferson's draft to the Declaration of Independence side by side with a document, a petition written by the Blacks of Boston 3 years earlier. What is this populous, pleasant, and plentiful country that these Africans from Boston were talking about? Well, I don't have time to go into all the different African kingdoms that had risen and fallen over time, the Nile Valley of Egypt and Nubia, the Kush Empire, ancient Ghana, Songhai, Mali, and go on, but there's not enough time. But that's what they're talking about, a very populous and plentiful country, but that's not how the Europeans would see it as they began to discover the world in the age of exploration. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a map. This map gives you a sense of the major areas of the transatlantic slave trade of where Africans were captured, held, and exported. The larger the circle, the more Africans left from those particular regions on the west coast of Africa. Now, I'm just focusing on the West African slave trade, not the East African trade to the Middle East. Just for those who may have that question, this is going to focus on West Africa, West Central Africa, and as you see a little circle in Southeast Africa, as well as Madagascar. There were some who were brought here to the Americas as well during that time period. But the European slavers, there were going to be some things that the European slavers thought were very important. Because as they began to explore the world in the age of exploration, everybody knows 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. As the Spanish and Portuguese are exploring the world, they and other Europeans began to develop these theories of race, which becomes race science. European philosophers in the 16th, 17th, particularly the 18th century, scientists, and then even theologians, because we're dealing with a time period of church and state, okay? The church and the government are the same, church and state. And so with the curse of Ham, it's in the Bible in Genesis 9:25. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the curse of Ham, you can ask in the Q&A. But essentially what's happening, if you look at this depiction, the original curse of Ham were the poor European peoples, the peasant class in Europe. It was a way for the church to say to them that this is your station in life. You're not going to improve. It is you who is to serve us. And the Bible says that you are the cursed descendants of Ham, and you must serve us, which would be their fellow men who were gentry, people involved in the hierarchy. So you can see this young British girl serving the British family. So they were the cursed descendants of Ham. But as the slave trade began to develop, the theologians shifted and made the Africans the cursed descendants of Ham. And again, they would justify it to use as a means of justifying the transatlantic slave trade as well as slavery. One of the other important technologies besides shipbuilding and gunpowder was the printing press, because now the scientists, the philosophers, they could now print their books and they could exchange their different ideas about race as they begin to encounter Native Americans and Africans. And most of the information was not coming from European observation itself. It was coming from missionaries, Europeans involved in the slave trade. Those are the people who are actually engaging with Africans and Native Americans and were participating in developing these notions of what we refer to today as race science, science based on biology. And so the slave trade evolves at that same time. So I had one historian I invited, he said it was like a perfect storm, a perfect storm for the Europeans who were going to profit from the slave trade, but a perfect storm of horror for Africans, Native Americans, and others who would become, whose oppression would be justified by theology, by science, and by other means their oppression would be solidified through those means. Now, let's take a look at African slavers. Now, African slavers were those who were involved in the slave trade, who were trading with the Europeans. And here is one example. This is Brandy King George. This is not actually an image of him, but he was from Calabar. So if you look on the map, you see the Bight of Biafra. Today, that would be Nigeria. And he was trading with his trading partners. And the Africans, as they traded, whether they were trading with the British or the Portuguese or the Spanish, they had diplomatic relationships. Yes, diplomatic relationships with their trading partners, which also included literacy. They would send their sons to Europe to learn the language as well as the math, because they wanted to make sure the slave traders weren't cheating them, their trading partners who were treating them. And so here is one example of a letter written by Brandy King George to his business partner, Mr. Jones, Merchant Jones, he calls him, in Bristol. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he says to Merchant Jones in Bristol, "My friend, sir, I take this opportunity to write to you, my old acquaintance, and I let you know what Captain Lewis been done me, 20 slaves. I bet, I be sell all my first trade." And he goes on. But there's a series of letters from Calabar that were written by Africans, in this case in English, but like I said, in Portuguese and so forth. This would go back and forth. So there was literacy that was being developed in Africa. So this idea that somehow there's some magic potion that Africans are not able to grasp, we have evidence that they were able to. Now, next, this is Prince William Ansa Cesaroku from Ghana. So as you look on the map, you see the Ghana was going to be at the Bight of Benin. I'm sorry, the Gold Coast. See that circle where it says the Gold Coast. Now, he was one of the sons who was sent to Europe to be educated. I could tell you his story, but I have to be aware of my time. His father sent him to Europe. He got on a slave ship. He went to Barbados. He was actually trapped in Barbados for a while. His father wrote a letter to his merchant friend and told him to return his son, and they would do no trading until his son is returned. They were able to rescue the son and bring him to Europe. He was treated as a celebrity, and he was then eventually able to return back to Ghana on the Gold Coast once he finished his education. Now, it was not like an Ivy League education. It was an education to help with the trade with Europeans. All right, now, so I'm going to take a quick stop right here before, just to check and see if there's any questions or comments that anyone may have about that section of European and African traders, which I know can be a difficult subject for some people. I understand, but let's see if there are any questions or chat.
We do have a few questions, and we do have a question in the chat. If there is, if you're adding questions in the chat, please make sure they're clear so that we can answer your questions appropriately. The first question, I think that relates to the very first experiment. Did the children have unconscious biases?
I would have to read the full paper. I think that's probably available online or probably in the archives. But you have to keeping everything in context. Number one, for people of a certain generation, you would know there were only 3 networks at that time period. So there was not 24/7 television. Of course, there was no cell phones and all that. Most of the interaction people were going to have were going to be face-to-face, maybe a radio. If you could afford a television at that time, 1954, you might have a black and white television or maybe a color television. The children were living in segregated neighborhoods, going to segregated schools where the schools, in many cases, were falling down around them. Some would talk about how they would drive past the white school and they would see everything pristine and clean and brick buildings, and they would go to their school, such as Barbara Johns here in Virginia, in Farmville, Virginia. She started a strike because of the conditions in the school. Eventually, her case was part of Brown versus the Board of Education. So what they were seeing was right before them. I mean, she was in the classroom, you got water dripping down, you have to put buckets in the classroom because the water is dripping from the ceiling. So what they're seeing is they're able to see what type of conditions that they and their parents live in, but they're also able to see what many of the white children have that they don't have. So hopefully that answered their question.
Thank you. The next question, I believe it has to do with the curse that you were.
The curse of Ham.
The curse of Ham. They would like to know more.
Okay. The curse of Ham, as I said, was originally used to justify the oppression of Europeans, the poor, the peasant class, to tell them, you have no chance in life. This is what God has decided. You are cursed. Now, the curse comes from Genesis. It comes from the story of Noah, when Noah's ark, and after Noah landed, there is a story where Noah creates a vineyard and he becomes intoxicated. And during his intoxication, he falls down, and there's different versions of the curse of Ham. But essentially, his nude body is exposed. His son Ham comes by and looks upon his father's nude body, and he runs back and he tells his other two brothers, Seth, I think it's Seth, that their father is inebriated. The other two sons, and you'll see biblical depictions of it. His other two sons, they walk backwards carrying a cloth to cover their father because they should not look upon their father's nude body. So as the two sons put the cloth over Noah, Noah arises and says to Ham, I know what you have done, and I curse your children, even though the original curse was on Ham's children, not on him himself. But I curse your children, and they shall be servants of servants forever. So you will serve your brothers forever. So in this case, when it came to Africans being the curse of Ham and not Europeans, they were saying that the African or Black race was to serve the white race because it was in the Bible. And you have to understand how serious people were about the Bible at that time period. If they said, and just as people are today, if the Bible said that you were cursed, and I think the Catholics refer to the Africans as enemies of Christ, if that's coming from your church, then now you don't have to feel bad about what happens to these Africans. They're the enemies of Christ, or they are cursed by Ham. And the only thing that we can do as Europeans is benefit them and provide them Christian salvation and civilization, which I'll get to later. So that's a quick synopsis of, or a quick description of the curse of Ham, but it was very strongly held by people. Matter of fact, and then I'll have to move on to the next section and then answer some more questions. For example, John Newton, many of you may sing the song in your church, the hymn in your church, Amazing Grace. Now, Amazing Grace was written by John Newton. John Newton was a slave ship captain, and he was a Christian. He was taking Africans from Bunce Island near Sierra Leone, transporting them to the Carolinas, particularly South Carolina. He had no problem. Let me put it this way. Slavery was a respectable trade. You could be a Christian slave ship captain and feel no remorse for these cursed children of Ham, because sometimes they would use that term. People are coming off the ships and they're emaciated, near death, and they would just say, oh, pitiful, cursed children of Ham. It's just pitiful. But it was not inconsistent with being a Christian and being a slaver, because from the Christian point of view, in that time period, they were doing the Africans a favor. So if you have more questions about that, we can talk about it. But just to wrap up John Newton. So John Newton writes Amazing Grace. Many people, Black and white, sing Amazing Grace throughout the country, and they should continue to sing it. But it just shows you just how, I know it's difficult to hear it today, but how normal it was, how respectable it was in its time period. And I could go on, but I need to continue with the next section of the presentation. Now, let's look at some of the African victims of the slave trade. And some of you may be familiar with Phyllis Wheatley. may not be familiar with Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, and then also the Christians in Congo. So let's start with Phyllis Wheatley. Again, I'm going to go just quickly. Phyllis Wheatley was captured from the Senegambia area of West Africa. She was about the age of 8. So she's about the age of those children in the doll test. But she's about the age of 8. She was captured, and you can imagine by the time she was transported to Boston, she was very emaciated. She was very sickly. They didn't think she would survive. So the Wheatley family took her in. She began to learn. They taught her to read the Bible, Greek, Latin, and then she began to do the higher form of intelligence at that time period, writing. She began writing poetry. So the question then becomes, Phyllis is writing poetry, but how is that so? Because at that time period, people believe that Africans are these savages, non-Christian, animalistic. They don't have the intelligence. All of these different theories are being developed and investigated by scientists in Europe. And so Phyllis Wheatley had to do something that may be similar to what many of you are doing as students at NCU. She had to have an oral defense. Now, many of you may have had an oral defense for your thesis or your dissertation, and you may remember what that was like. Maybe it was before 2 or more people. But Phyllis Wheatley, on the other hand, she had to defend her poetry before 19 gentlemen of Boston. They had to authenticate it because it was difficult to believe that someone coming from Africa to survive the Middle Passage and being a female and being so young can absorb these higher, what the Europeans considered higher level intelligence, thinking of reading and writing, decoding signs and symbols, and comprehending it. So 19 of these men in Boston had to certify her, if you will, that she was the person who wrote the poems. This was their verdict. The verdict of the 19 men was that, and you can see I just highlighted, oh, I'm sorry. I highlighted a few of the words in their verdict. But they said, again, that we do assure the world that the poems specified in the following pages were, as we veritably believe, written by Phyllis, a Negro, from an uncultivated barbarian from Africa. Okay. So again, speaking of intelligence, are Africans capable of it? And again, at the end, they said they examined she was examined by some of the best judges and is thought qualified to write them. So the impact of these ideas of race science, or the science of race, impacts whites as well as blacks. Obviously it impacts blacks, but it impacts whites and Europeans because they can't believe, or many of them can't, except for their owners. The Wheatley's owner thought that Africans could learn to read and write if given an opportunity, but the prevailing thought was that they were not intelligent people who could have the intelligence to read and or write. So now let's move on to the next victim, Ayuba Suleiman Diallo. This map of the east coast of the United States, or British North America before the American Revolution. The larger the circles, the more Africans were imported into those areas. Suleiman Diallo was a prince. He was captured and he was enslaved in Annapolis, Maryland in 1731. And so as a prince, of course, he did not feel that he should be in jail. So that he should be a slave. So he ran away. He was captured. They put him in jail. And while he was in jail, he aroused the curiosity of people in the town because he was scribbling something on the wall. They didn't know what it was, but they're like, look like he's trying to write, but I can't make out what he's trying to write. Now, he also was from the Senegambia area, as was Phyllis Wheatley. And as you can see in this painting of him, you can probably already know that he was a Muslim. And one aspect that people tend to forget when talking about literacy is that in West Africa, particularly in the Sudan, when Islam began to spread into the Sudan was these West African Sudanic kingdoms. And one of them was Timbuktu. You probably saw Timbuktu on the map. The previous slide, you saw Timbuktu on the map. And there were people who said that the books were one of the most important trade items during the time period of those Sudanic kingdoms. So they were reading and writing and classic Arabic, some of the studies, these were Quranic schools, universities, and some of their studies included the histories of the Sudanic kingdoms, the history of the Sudanic kingdoms, the literature, poetry, like Phyllis Wheatley, she's from that region, she was from that region, the sciences, astrology, medicine, ethics. If you only look at history through Judeo-Christian European lens, you're gonna miss those aspects of Islam that was involved in West African history and also in literacy of African people. I could say more about that, but there are time restraints. Now, Suleiman Diallo, he was captured. To make a long story short, he was able to negotiate his way back to his homeland. But on the way back, he stopped in Europe. And when he was in Europe, they wanted to paint this portrait of him. Well, Suleiman Diallo, being a Muslim, did not want an image of him. So he said, look, I will sit for a painting, for a portrait painting, if you allow me to wear that red object around his neck. What do you think that red object around his neck is? Some of you may have gotten it. It's a Quran. It's not just any Quran. It's a Quran that he wrote from memory. And it was the third copy of the Quran that he wrote. So he said, if you allow me to wear my Quran, I will sit for the painting. And there's also a second painting of Diallo as well that exists. So those are some of the victims. Now let's take a look at another group of victims, the third group, and that's going to be in the Congo, where you see the large circle, West Central Africa. The Portuguese were able to send Christian missionaries to that region, and some of the early Africans who were enslaved in the Americas were Christians. So here's a painting, and I, being a visual artist, I'll tell you a few things about this painting. This is a watercolor painting from life. Many times what happens, an artist, a person who's in Africa, in this case, in Angola region of the Congo, he paints a watercolor painting, sends it back to Europe, and then the engravers in Europe who've never been to Africa will then reinterpret those images. So sometimes the engravings are not accurate for that reason. But when you have a watercolor painting, you have more of an accurate depiction. Now notice with these masks, this Catholic mass, notice the books in the hands of these Africans, and these Angolans, not Africans, but Angolans. And whether they're the Bible or the Book of Common Prayer, this becomes a challenge for those who are condoning the slave trade. There were those, like the kings and queens, the monarchy and merchants, who were on the side of just make them slaves. We don't care if they're baptized or not. There were some members of the church who took their Christian missionary duties to provide Christian salvation very seriously. So you had this back and forth that was going on, whether it be the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church. They all took different methods to try and provide salvation for the enslaved, while others could care less. They were bringing them to the Americas to work, and they could care less if they were proselytized to or not. So that's just one quick example of the African literacy that was performed by some of the victims of the slave trade. So let me move forward. Now, this is the sacred and the secular. Now we're looking at British North America. So the question is, were slaves forbidden to read and write? Well, let me show you a few things before we get to your answers to that question. Black literacy, sacred or secular? Well, first, there are questions that people have very early on in the 1600s when they're enslaving African people, is whether they should be baptized. Because the question was, they would say, look, they'd have the Bible and they would say, if I baptize my slave, won't I have to free them? Is there any place in the Bible where it says Christians should enslave other Christians? So this was a dilemma for the colonists. But again, for those who were interested in primarily in the labor of Africans and not in their salvation, by as early as 1667, they had passed a law where they said that baptism does not change their condition from bondage to a free person. So you're free to continue to use them as slaves, even though you may Christian them and provide for them salvation. But they will be denied the sacrament of marriage. They will not allow to be married because they are considered property for their owners. But the church did do one thing. There was a philanthropic group called the Bray Associates in Virginia. And the Church of England, which was the established Church of Virginia, because there was church and state, again, no separation of church and state. And so they provided a school called the Bray School. It was in several places. Williamsburg, Virginia was one of them. And this is where children, basically between the ages of 3 and 10, would be taught how to read, and we believe how to write. And so their teacher was Miss Ann Wager. And as you can see on the screen, it tells you some of the things that they were taught: how to write, pronounce their words correctly. Also, she taught them how to spell and their stops. Their stops means where you put your period at the end of a sentence. So, so again, it was not to make them scholars, but more like the Native American mission schools. It was to make them good Christian servants or Christian slaves. There were also others who thought it was a great idea. Again, all the whites in the colonies were not the same. Some of them thought it was very important. Here's one person, he's reporting to the Bray Associates. He's saying, look, I find an old Negro who's able to read. I give him a Bible. I instruct him to go and baptize the other people. Okay, so you can imagine that he's not only baptizing other people, I would assume, I can only make conjecture that he was probably also teaching them how to read and write. Now, on the other hand, you had some other colonists who were concerned. They said, no, no, no. If you baptize them, it makes them more difficult to control, that they become insolent, idols, and runaways. Now they're not content with their place in life if you expose them to the sacred literature of the Bible. Because when most people read, it was going to be through the Bible, Black or white, in the 18th century, at least for Virginia. Well, if they thought that was trouble, trouble came through the Great Awakening. As the Great Awakening was a religious revival, some whites were also didn't like the structure of the Church of England. They thought it was too structured. And so the revival was something that really attracted African Americans, free Blacks and slaves, to the movement. And now let me explain some things that attracted them. When they went to these revivals, people like George Whitefield, Samuel Davies, they would be on these tall platforms. They'd be preaching to hundreds of people. And so as a slave person, you're looking for any ray of light, any ray of hope. And when you see all these white people who are dancing and shouting, unlike the Church of England, where everyone has to be stoic, listen to the minister, but they saw the expression, they saw them shouting, they saw the body movements. For many of those Africans, that was similar to their form of worship of themselves when they were in Africa, or maybe they saw their grandparents with that type of performance, if you will. But also, another thing that attracted African Americans to the Great Awakening was that these new light preachers believed in the spiritual equality of Blacks and whites. That was radical for that time period. Just to say that Blacks and whites were equal spiritually was radical. Also, now they had a direct connection with God. They didn't have to go through the hierarchy of the Church of England. It's this yourself and God. And Samuel Davies, he talks about as a minister. He said on Sunday, he would have Negroes in his house all night in his kitchen, sometimes about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and they're singing these hymns, and the sound of it is pouring into the chamber. And he's just in a state of ecstasy listening to this, because he's giving them Bibles. He's teaching them how to read and write. So sacred literacy was going to be very important for the enslaved and free Black community. Now, very quickly, let me just show you how it manifests itself when you look at some of the runaway ads. I'll just go through them very quickly. Jamie passes for a freeman. He's fond of singing hymns and preaching. What about Jack? He's a carpenter by trade. He forged the past. He never intended to serve any man as a slave again, and he pretends to be much religious. What about Charles? Charles also passes as a free man. He reads tolerably well and is a great preacher, and he's outlawed, which means he's wanted dead or alive. Now, they would give you more money for them dead than alive. So it says his head severed from his body. So we got to move quickly now to the secular. How were free Blacks and slaves able to learn to read and write who were not part of a religious revival or through the Bible? Well, that's going to be through being in the trades. Here's one person. Let's look at Nancy real quickly. Nancy, she sells her cakes, but Nancy also speaks very good Dutch, and she can read and write, and she's going to forge a pass. Let's go on to Billy. Billy, he's a carpenter. He's going to pass, but he's an extraordinary good tradesman. So you see these people. Ari, who's an African of yellowish color, he also can both read and write and will forge a pass. One of the things that they all have in common is that they are tradesmen, artisans. And in Virginia, I can't say this for every colony, but in Virginia, if you were an apprentice starting in 1705, it was the obligation of the owner to teach you how to read and write according to the needs of your trade. So this is just a quick example of Matthew Ashby and his apprenticeship to John Cole. So that's one way that Blacks could learn to read and write. Another way was private education. Your owner can teach you to read and write. In this case, George Wythe teaches Jamie. Someone who sees him, not, we assume, teaching Jamie how to read, because now he's teaching Jamie how to write. Same thing you saw in the story of Frederick Douglass, how he was taught by his owner. But also there are free Blacks. Here's Matthew Ashby. He's the uncle of the first Matthew Ashby I showed you. His children attended the Bray School. He had books in his inventory. And when he died in his last will and testament, he asked for the executor to look out for the education and maintenance of his 2 children and good Christian way of his wife. So again, you can see that those are different ways that they're being taught how to being exposed, if you will, how to read and write. So identity, how are they using reading and writing? Well, there's several ways that they would use that in British North America. It varies from colony to colony, but I'm just concentrating right now on Virginia because I could be here all day. And of course, my time is pretty short as it is. So we've seen free Blacks. So now let's look at, again, going back to the Boston petition. They wrote several petitions, but again, protest. They wrote the petition to the governor. We have no property. We have no wives, no children. We have no city, no country, signed by Felix. You also have 6 months after the Declaration of Independence. Once again, the great petition from the great number of Blacks in Boston, detained in the a state of slavery and the bowels of a free and Christian country. So again, they're pointing out the contradictions, but they're also saying that, claiming their ownership also of the Declaration of Independence, when they say we have in common with all other men the natural and unalienable right and the freedom of that great parent of the universe. Also, identity. The first time that African American is used that we can find so far was in 1872 in the newspaper in Philadelphia. Now it's hard to see, but under the term, well, you see 2 sermons, and then it said writer by the African American. Okay, so that's one of the early terms, because again, They're identifying with African. Many of our earliest institutions, the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal, African Zion Church, African Free School, before the Prince Hall Freemasons in the Revolutionary time period became the Prince Hall Freemasons, they were the African Lodge. So this was a term that Black people were using to identify themselves, particularly after the American Revolution. But also, before the time of Frederick Douglass, they could also take on and challenge some of the race science of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson says that Blacks are inferior to whites in both body and mind. Well, that's when you have someone like Benjamin Banneker, who writes a letter to Jefferson, and he takes Jefferson on and he quotes Jefferson's own words that he says will live through all ages, that all men are created equal. Very famous quote, I'm sure we all know. Then there's literacy and abolition. Olato Equiano, an African who writes about the slave trade as a victim. He writes about the Middle Passage. So he puts a face on this transatlantic slave trade, and he's among the important abolitionists of the time period. Now, I know we're coming up to the end here. So do we have the results of the question, do you believe that slaves were, that it was illegal for slaves to learn to read and write?
Yes. So we have an astounding yes of 89%, and 11% answered no to that question.
Okay, now I'm going to reveal the answer to that question. You've seen some of it now. So let me reveal the final part of the presentation. I'll go through this very quickly. You may have thought that maybe one of the larger rebellions caused slaves, a law to be written to prevent slaves from reading and writing, and that would be the Stoner Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739. So in 1740, yes, South Carolina did create a law to prevent slaves from reading and writing. But we're going to, again, focus on Virginia. By 1805, this young nation of the United States now says in Virginia that the person who owns a Black orphan does not have, the apprentice does not have to teach them how to read and write. That's no longer a requirement. I'm not sure why that happened, but it did. By 1819, now they're saying, and listen to this very quickly, it says that in Virginia, it's a common practice in many places within the Commonwealth for slaves to assemble in considerable numbers for the teaching of reading and writing. Therefore, any meetings would be considered an unlawful assembly. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. Next, by 1831, now they're including free Blacks along with enslaved people and saying it's an unlawful assembly to bring them together to teach them how to read and write. And most time the fine is there's a fine or there's a whipping, but not death for reading and writing. Let's go on. I conclude. Here's a turning point. Many of you may know about Nat Turner's Rebellion. Now, that 1831 law that I showed you, that law was passed in the spring. And the fall, in August, was Nat Turner's Rebellion. After Nat Turner's Rebellion, then you see laws in 1832 that become more harsh. Because now it's not just Black literacy, it's Black sacred literacy. Because now it's also the preachers. And they begin to call it an illegal gathering. So now, once Blacks were independent preachers in their churches, but now those churches had to be monitored by white preachers to make sure no one was preaching a message of sedition like Nat Turner. So you start seeing the literacy being tied into the preachers and to the Black churches after Nat Turner Rebellion here in Virginia, and you see it in other places. They're also concerned about abolitionist movements, any form of writing and so forth. You can receive 39 lashes. And then finally in 38, the Blacks obviously adjusted to this, the free Blacks and slaves. They begin to go out of the state to get their education and then come back. Well, once the legislators found out about that, then they passed a law in 1838, which said that if you leave Virginia, whether you're an infant or an adult, and you leave, you cannot come back. It would be unlawful for you to return. So you can't even go to another state to get educated and come back in Virginia. So at that point, when you get to the time period of Frederick Douglass, yes, the laws are pretty harsh. There's this time period where now it's very difficult because the free Black population had to educate its own people in order to continue to be prosperous. But with these various laws, it made it difficult for free Blacks as well as slaves. But I will give you one last thing as we come to a close. One thing that was quite peculiar, many of the slave owners would not prevent slaves from learning their numbers, how to cipher numbers. Can you guess why? Well, if their enslaved person is taking their goods to the market, they want to make sure that enslaved person knows how much money they should get in return, that they do know math. So that was not prevented, whether it's in South Carolina, I've seen it in other Southern states, they would not prevent Blacks from learning numbers, but reading and writing was a concern. So I'm going to stop at this point. Matter of fact, that's the end of the presentation. I know we've gone over the time by a couple of minutes, but I leave it up to you.
No problem. We'll be happy to go over time if that's okay with you to answer a few questions. It's
Sure.
up to you and how you would like to move forward, Harvey.
Yes, I can answer a few questions.
Okay, so we'll allow people. We're getting a lot of people in the chat who are very happy about the information you're sharing today. They're learning a lot. They're excited and singing your praises in the chat. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, actually, let's go. I think a couple of these were questions relating to just some of the information you were sharing.
Yes.
Someone asked, were they allowed to mate even though they were not married? I'm assuming that's with the slaves.
Yes, they were allowed to get married, but the marriages were not legally recognized because obviously the Bible says I'm just tired, my tongue is tied now, but they would not sanction the marriage. Now, in certain South American countries with the Catholic Church, they did recognize the marriage as a Christian, but not in the Protestant countries. Here in British North America. I can't speak for New England, but for the most part, no. So they could get married. And here's the thing that people miss out when they do not include free Blacks in the discussion of early African-American history. Many times people just talk about the slaves, the slaves, the slaves. Many families were mixed between free Blacks and enslaved people. Many free Black men married enslaved wives, and then their children would be enslaved. So Black families could be very complicated. And so when we tell history and we leave out the free Blacks as if they're free and all their problems are solved, we're doing a disservice to the humanity of the people who had to live with some of the difficult choices that people had to make when their family is half free and half slave.
Awesome. Okay, I think that is all for the questions that we have in our docket. Do you have any other statements you'd like to add, Harvey?
No, I would just say that hopefully people would think more about that question when people are making the assumptions about African-American literacy. You just need to rephrase the question. Instead of saying it was illegal for slaves to learn how to read and write, slaves would be killed, the question should be, when was it illegal for slaves to learn to read and write? During the colonial time period, up until 1819 in Virginia, it was never illegal by law. But I will say this, even though the laws were created in 1819, white citizens, whether in Virginia or New England, could attack Blacks who tried to educate their community. They didn't need a law to shut them down. There was a case of a Christopher, I can't remember his last name right now, here in Virginia. He was trying to start a night school for free Blacks and slaves, and the whites in the community shut it down. And New England, it was the same way. In Boston, there was another Black school they had built, and people in the community, they brought in oxen and pulled the school off its foundation. So whites did not, in the colonial time period, early America, did not need a law to attack Black education. It was just part of the part of the fact that free Blacks and slaves did not have legal protection. So when that happened to their communities, they would have to rebuild and find other ways to get around the restrictions.
Well, thank you so much, Harvey Bakari, for taking the time out and educating us on some of the amazing information and very, I think, thought-provoking for a lot of people. We also want to thank our attendees for joining us today. As a reminder, the recording will be posted in the CTL LibGuides within 24 hours. Again, thank you all for joining, and thank you, Harvey Bakari, for taking the time out.